Who would have thunk it? FAU is taking over the SEC transfer market.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national hoop show out there. We're your hosts today. This is our guy, Andy Patton. I'm Isaac Shade, and you're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making us your first listen or watch, and a reminder that you can get every episode ad-free on Amazon Music. Special shout out to all you everydayers joining us and everyone coming in from the Locked On College Basketball Discord. So glad that you're all here. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. In the dog days of summer, the sports stop sportsing like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Andy, it's the end of transfer portal week here on the show. Monday, we started with ACC. We've gone through Big 12, Big East, Big 10, and we're wrapping up the week here today with SEC. But it ain't over, because next Monday, as you restart the week, we will do a best of the rest show. Don't miss that one as well. So, Andy, today we're talking our all SEC transfer class. We're going to look at the best overall portal classes, and we're going to give you some superlatives. Going to be a lot of fun. Andy, we're diving right on into this first team. I already hinted at it, but how about FAU? Maybe going to have 40% of this starting five. Andy, what do you think? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's funny when we're putting this list together. And for those of you who've been listening to the shows, you know, we kind of agonized over trying to pick a top five for conferences like the Big 10 and the Big 12, and they had these tremendous transfer portal classes. And for the SEC, we really struggled as well. We kind of had 3 or 4 that we picked, and we're like, all right, these guys are locked in. We're for sure feeling like these are some of the 5 best transfers coming in to the SEC. And then we really struggled to pick those last kind of 2 spots on this list. But when we kind of nailed down the first couple of names, 2 of them came from Florida Atlantic, and John L. Davis, of course, going to Arkansas, joining John Calipari over there in his first year with the Razorbacks. And then Elijah Martin staying in state, going from FAU to Florida, going to Todd Golden and the Gators. And they've had a lot of success with transfer portal guards in the short tenure that Golden has had with the Gators. And so for us, it felt like we have John L. Davis 1, Elijah Martin 3. I don't know how strongly we feel about the actual order here, but for 2 players from that FAU program to be in this conversation. We talked about Vlad Golden, who went to Michigan, who actually followed Coach Dusty May on the Big 10 show. So 3 of FAU's key contributors from that team that went to the Final Four 2 years ago, that made the NCAA tournament last year in their first year in the AAC. We've seen that roster kind of split apart as Dusty May left, but the fact that we're talking about a handful of those players as being some of the biggest contributors next year in the Big 10 and the SEC is a very strong testament to not only how we feel about FAU and how talented that roster was, but how clearly other folks in college basketball feel about these guys if they're getting to go to Florida and Arkansas and Michigan to have their next season of their careers.
That's a great point, Andy. Obviously, yesterday we talked about Vlad Golden, and as you said on that show, had things worked out at Michigan for John L. Davis, we might not be talking about him today. In between these 2 owls, we have Tremont Mark, who, you know, on paper, it would be easy to think he's transferring from the SEC to the Big 12, but not true. He's staying in the SEC, 16 points a game last year at Arkansas, and comes over to the Longhorns this year as they make their transition into the SEC. The other 2 players, well, I'll just do the next one of them, and then we can round out with that conversation we had about the 5th spot there. But is our first kind of big here on the list, and that's Cliff Omori, who comes from Rutgers to Alabama. And Andy, while, you know, Nick Pringle was kind of the big, we had, you know, Jaren Stevenson and Grant Nelson kind of slotting in there at times, but they're more the 4 really in terms of what's going to happen. All due respect to Nick Pringle, he's always been a bit up and down to me. I think Cliff Omori is the big that Nate Oates needs to really make this thing cook at the 5. I think he is a vicious lob threat. He's a great defender. He's going to protect the rim. And with what he brings, with what they're going to have at their other more, if you'll allow me a football term, skill set positions, then I really think that he's going to be a massive contributor for this Bama team.
Yeah, I'll give a quick analysis on those guys before we get to number 5. Tremont Mark, yeah, fantastic addition for Texas. They also get Jordan Pope from Oregon State. For those of you who have listened to the last few shows, we don't put multiple players from the same school in the top 5. I don't know if we would have necessarily had Jordan Pope in the top 5, but he's very close. Those two players, really nice additions for Rodney Terry and the Longhorns. And yeah, for Alabama, like they were obviously extremely good last year, but I think the spread offense, the ability to have a lot of 3-point shooters on the floor really works for them in a lot of ways. But I think having a defensive anchor down low is, even if it's just matchup specific, and I think Omori is going to play quite a bit, obviously, for Bama, but there will be lineups maybe where they want a bit more of that floor spacing. But Charles Bediako was such a huge piece for Bama when he. And I think getting a player who can kind of protect the rim and be an anchor down low feels like something that you want on that roster that was absent last year. So this feels like a really nice fit for him heading from Rutgers over to that Crimson Tide team.
Andy, that's a great point. Let me just come back with that real quick before you transition to the 5th player. The offensive efficiency is always going to be there for this team. But the key to these Nate Oates teams is which years the defense is there and which years it isn't. When they had Bediako 2 years ago was when they were the number 1 team in the nation. And not that, look, they clearly weren't slouches last year, right? Yeah. But this is the thing that could put them over the top. Go ahead.
So 5th and final spot, we had a lot of deliberation about this. We talked about players. We are ultimately going to end up not going with anybody from Kentucky. So there's a spoiler for you there. But we talked about potentially having Jackson Robinson in this conversation. We talked about Kirk Kriisa. We talked about some other guys who we think are going to be incredibly impactful transfers next season in the SEC. But ultimately, we settled on going with Chaz Lanier. Chaz Lanier is transferring from North Florida to Tennessee, joining Rick Barnes' team in what is a very solid transfer portal class for the Vols. I really like the group that they're bringing in here. And yes, the Dalton Connect effect is a part of this conversation, having seen what Tennessee does when they bring in a guard who's going to step in and play a high on-ball, plenty of scoring opportunities. And we saw Barnes kind of just let Connect loose and let him be a big-time offensive threat. And he was an All-American, arguably the second best player in college basketball last year. And while we can't just assume that that's going to happen with Chaz Lanier, there are enough similarities in their style of gameplay and in the production that Lanier had at North Florida to assume that at least Rick Barnes is going to give him that opportunity. Obviously, Connect is not back. They lost a handful of other really important pieces. Santiago Vescovi is gone for Tennessee. Jonas Adu, of course, hit the portal. And so I think for Tennessee, Lanier's going to have those opportunities to be a high-level scorer. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's back in this if he's kind of in this conversation as one of the most productive players in the entire conference. So while there's a ton of other great options, many of whom we'll talk about, especially in that final segment, we ultimately settled on Lanier being the pick here.
And obviously the others, when we looked at it, Jackson Robinson was in key consideration for us. And Andy, I think the way you and I were both feeling as we were putting this list together, I think we honestly probably would have felt just as comfortable with Robinson as this 5th pick. But at some point you got to draw a line, and we did. So, but clearly we think Robinson is going to be a great player in Lexington this year. We've seen it last year for Mark Pope at BYU. And, there are other times when he's been at this level prior and he didn't do it. But once guys figured out a lot of times, then they've got it going moving forward. So obviously Robinson's going to be a great player for Big Blue Nation this year.
Well, we talked players. Now it's time to pick our top 5 transfer portal classes in the SEC. And folks, the big question is a simple one: Kentucky or Arkansas? We're going to get to that in just a second. I want to tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience. That's the formula for winning championships. And it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, folks, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, Isaac, moving on here in our SEC conversation, talking about players in the first segment, talking about the 5 best transfers, at least our preseason predictions for the 5 best transfers coming into the conference. And folks, if you want to hear more about these specific transfer classes, team by team, if you want to hear more about the SEC at large, obviously a lot of football talk on the Locked On SEC podcast, but Chris Gordy does a fantastic job covering football and basketball for that conference. If you're looking for specific teams, Lance Stoff, friend of the program, friend of ours, does a great job at Locked On Kentucky, John Neighbors at Locked On Arkansas, Luke Robinson, Locked On Bama. All the shows are fantastic. Definitely go check them out if you haven't yet. They're all available wherever you find Locked On College Basketball. You can find all those team-specific shows as well. All right, enough lead up. The big conversation. We're ranking 5 teams in terms of their overall transfer portal class. But I'll tell you right now, the 2 John Calipari programs are 1 and 2, and the order, drum roll, we're leading with John Calipari's new team, the Arkansas Razorbacks.
Yes, Andy, we sure are. And this was a fun conversation of ranking these, because it feels like we just went 2 teams at a time, and each time we would kind of like talk depth versus talent and quality, quantity, like we've done all these. So this was a really fun exercise for me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Ultimately, it's interesting because Arkansas has this 5-player class, while Kentucky's is much deeper in terms of depth. That's a funny statement to make. But with Kentucky's, we have talked about this quite a bit. Like, anytime you're making like a trade, I want the best player out of it. And for me, the player that has been the most productive out of either of these classes is John L. Davis. And I think the best college basketball player, and I think that's an important specific distinction to make, of college basketball player over long-term NBA potentiality. But then you look at the other stuff. Obviously, Jonas Adu has been very capable at the highest level. I know Tennessee fans watching and listening to this are probably like, yeah, but where did he go at the end of the season? Why isn't he tougher? I hear that, but he's going to be a very good college big. Adu Thiero obviously has done it very well at Kentucky with John Calipari. And then Big Z, we think a big sophomore year is coming for him with having a true off season, not having to worry about the eligibility stuff. And then DJ Wagner, there was a point in time at which he was the number 1 player in last year's class. And so hopefully he can have a nice sophomore bump. And again, Kentucky has so many talented guys, but when we look at these side by side, we like the pieces of the Arkansas team better.
Yeah, I think that was kind of where it came down to was, Davis is better than I think any of the transfers coming in for Kentucky. And then if you do Davis and say Adu is the top 2, I still probably take that over the top 2 transfers coming in for Kentucky, which you can probably pick a lot of different guys there, whether you say it's Robinson and Carr or Robinson and Garrison or whomever you kind of think it might be. And it kind of going down the line, like top 3 for Arkansas, probably still better than the top 3 at Kentucky. And it gets a lot closer as you get into that conversation. And so for us, it was like, yeah, the quality is just slightly better enough for this Arkansas class to kind of outweigh the significantly more players that are coming in for Kentucky. But that's not to say anything negative about Kentucky's class, which is we have them second on this list, second in a conference that has a lot of really good transfer portal classes. I really like the roster construction. I think it's, again, when trying to rank these transfer portal classes, that is an important piece of it, is like, do these players fit in to the returning players in some situations, not at Kentucky. So for Kentucky, it's more, how do these pieces all fit together? I was a little intrigued by them getting two peer point guards in Kirk Risa and Lamont Butler. But I think that I really like the complementary skill sets that those two guys have. So I feel like that's going to work well. They needed a shooting. They get Kobe Brea. They needed a kind of a go-to scorer. They get Jackson Robinson. They needed some toughness in the backcourt. They get OF from Oklahoma. They needed some floor spacing in the front court. They get Andrew Carr. Like there's a lot of, they needed some shot blocking. They get Amari Williams from Drexel. That's why I like Kentucky's class a lot. And while the individual top tier talent is probably not on par with Arkansas or even frankly our third and fourth teams on this list, I think that their top tier transfers coming in are better than Kentucky's top tier transfers. But Kentucky gets the nod over our third team, which is Alabama. We really had a lot of debate between Kentucky and Alabama 2 and 3 here. But it's not just because Kentucky has more than twice as many transfers as Alabama, who just has 4 coming in. It's because while Alabama's the top of their transfer class is really good, I think it doesn't quite outweigh the overall amount of talent that's coming to Lexington next year and how all those pieces are going to fit together for Mark Pope's team.
Yeah, Andy, that was probably my favorite discussion we had, was comparing Bama and Kentucky. We've already talked about Cliff Omori. We don't need to relitigate that. But thinking about like Chris Youngblood coming from South Florida, Houston Millette from Pepperdine, these two dudes are really good and consistent scorers across multiple years of college basketball. The same is true of their outside shooting. You know, like Youngblood, we were talking about 3 straight years over 40% on 5 attempts a game from 3. Like it's that kind of thing, Andy, that it's like has Nate Oates salivating about these dudes. And then Aiden Holloway coming in, who was, I think it's fair to say, underwhelming in his freshman year at Auburn, but has so much potentiality and possibility. He is somebody that needs to shoot better from 3, but all 4 of these guys individually have something to be very excited about with them. And so Nate Oates, man, he just keeps it going.
Yeah. 4 and 5 on our list here. And we were close between Bama and Kentucky. And frankly, we were kind of close between Alabama and Texas as well. Texas comes in at number 4. I think 2, 3, and 4 on this list are very interesting because you have this huge transfer portal class at Kentucky. You have a smaller but very high quality transfer portal class at Alabama. And then at Texas, it's a little bit more of a mix. It's only 5. Alabama's was 4. So it's only 1 more player, but there's a little bit more kind of depth additions for Rodney Terry's team. That's not to be in any way, shape, or form disrespectful to Jason Kent or Julian Larry, both coming over from Indiana State. They're 2 very good players who I think are going to be impactful for Rodney Terry's club right away. Malik Presley from Vanderbilt, more of a depth option as well. But the top 2 players joining Texas's group, really, really good transfers. You got Tremont Mark coming over from Arkansas. We talked about him. He's incredibly talented, 16 points a game in the SEC. Now he's back in the SEC with Texas, but he's going to be a huge piece for this Longhorns club. And then you get Jordan Pope from Oregon State, 18 points a game last year for the Beavers, hit a game-winning shot over Arizona and a huge stunning upset for them. I really love these 2 guys a lot. This top 2 is as good as any class in this conference in terms of the top 2 players coming in. I really believe that. And so Texas was right behind Alabama just because I think the entirety of Bama's class is slightly ahead of Texas's, but honestly, those 2 teams are really close. And I think that this Texas group is going to be very good next year.
Yes, they absolutely are, Andy. And we get the 5th team on our list here is the only other state in the union that starts with a T. That's the Tennessee Volunteers. Obviously, we've already talked about Chaz Lanier, who we think is going to be great, but also Darlin Stone Dubar is another high-level transfer who just is going to bring a lot to the table as a bigger guard and can do things. We talked about Jonas Adu and Tennessee, a lot of Tennessee fans' frustration with his lack of like, well, I tell you what, Felix Okpara is the antidote for that because he's going to bring that toughness inside transferring over from Ohio State. But let's not forget about Igor Milicic, who started his career at Virginia. Andy has played at Charlotte the last 2 years, 12.8 points last year. He's a 6'10", listed as a guard, 8.5 boards last year, 1.7 assists, shoots like last year, 37.6% from outside on just shy of 5 attempts a game. And so he's going to bring some things to the table too here for Rick Barnes' club. And so Andy, these top 5 classes, I really like all of them.
Yeah, they're really good. And that's the reason that we feel like we had to leave out some really good classes. We had a couple honorable mentions. I think we have to talk Mizzou here, at least quickly, because if you use Evan Miyakawa's website, a friend of the program came on the show a few weeks ago. He had Mark Mitchell, the 5th ranked transfer in all of college basketball, coming over from Duke. He had Tony Perkins, who transferred to Mizzou from Iowa, as the 12th ranked transfer in all of college basketball. I don't always necessarily agree directly with the rankings. They're supposed to be subjective in some ways, but if Mizzou gets 2 top 15 transfers in all of college basketball coming off a year where they did not win a single game in the SEC, that is a tremendous offseason for Dennis Gates and the Tigers. I'm a big believer in Mark Mitchell. We will talk more about him later. I think this is a really quality class for the Tigers, but they just miss being in this conversation in part because it's just not a particularly big class, although they do get Jacob Cruz from UT Martin and Marquise Warwick from Northern Kentucky as well. And then Ole Miss, we had them kind of in consideration here as well. Sean Padula from Virginia Tech is kind of the main name there. Makeel Brown-Jones from Greensboro is a nice piece as well. So they're kind of in that conversation, but it was hard to argue with the top 5 teams here.
Yeah. Mizzou definitely, combining those guys with that loaded freshman class that's coming in should be a much better year in Columbia. Andy, we have to now get to our yearbook conversation. It's time to talk superlative. Which SEC transfer is the best fit, the most likely to be drafted next year, sophomore breakout, dark horse, all that and more coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel. Hey, we both love sports so much. We know that all of you love sports so much. But in these dog days of summer, we get fewer games in the sports. They just don't sports like we want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you got to do is open up the app anytime you're in the mood, and you can dream up these great bets. And also this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Andy, as we're talking about these SEC teams, we wanted to look at the top 5 with the best national championship odds. Alabama, number 1 at plus 1,300. Auburn, second at plus 2,500, followed by Arkansas at plus 3,000. Kentucky at plus 3,500. And then the Vols rounding out that top 5 at plus 5,000. So if you want to get in on that action, head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Our first superlative on the back end of today's shows, we're talking best fit. And Andy just mentioned his name, Mark Mitchell, coming over from 2 years at Duke to Missouri. Andy, this was kind of shocked me, I guess, in some ways that he left Duke. I guess I get it with everyone coming in. And there had been everything kind of the up and down, his dad getting into stuff. But Mark Mitchell, I think, Andy, a big part of this conversation is from Kansas City. For those who aren't aware, Columbia is basically right in between Kansas City and St. Louis. And so a nice getting back kind of closer to home. This seems to make some sense to us. And he should be able to be very helpful. We talked about that really talented incoming freshman class. Mark Mitchell knows what it's like to deal with the stress of being a high-level recruit coming into school.
Yeah, Mark Mitchell's a great fit for Dennis Gates' system, for his program. Anytime you can get a player this talented to come to your team when you weren't very good the year before, that's a massive win. So I think that, there's not a lot of additional conversation needed here. Dennis Gates got a huge home run with Mark Mitchell. I think he got a huge home run with Tony Perkins as well. He could be in this conversation, but Mitchell in particular is an excellent addition. And we have a couple honorable mentions. They're both for Alabama. We've seen Nate Oates. He loves his high scoring, high shooting types of guards and wings. We've seen players like Aaron Estrada and Latrell Wrightsell in recent years. And that's why I think Houston Millett and Chris Millett from Pepperdine, Youngblood from South Florida are both just tremendous fits in Nate Oates' system. They're both going to be just out on the wing, wreaking havoc as three-point shooters all season long. I think they're going to seamlessly fit into an offense with Mark Sears and the rest, and Grant Nelson and the rest of the pieces for the Crimson Tide. I love these two additions for Oates' team.
All right, Andy, as we get, this is maybe my favorite superlative we've been doing, the best up transfer. And as a reminder, when we get into up transfers, if there's somebody we've already talked about, like Chaz Lanier, he will not be on this list. So that's what he would be our choice for this. But we want to make sure to get a bunch of names in here. And so our winner here is Makeel Brown-Jones, who's coming from, started his career, by the way, at VCU for 2 years, the last 2 years at UNC Greensboro, where Andy last year, the 6'8" forward Makeel Brown-Jones, 18.9 points a game, 7.5 boards, blocked just shy of a shot, 1.1 assists. But even at that size, shot 43% on 2 3-point attempts a game. He's just under 80% from the free throw line, but he takes 7 attempts a game last year. Really think he could add a lot to this Ole Miss squad here for the Rebs. So going to be really interesting to see what he can do.
Yeah, I like this addition a lot. And when we're doing up transfers, there's a few mid-major conferences that we sort of just ruled out of this conversation. Mountain West, which is why we don't go with Lamont Butler. A-10, which is why we don't go with Kobe Brea. WCC, which is why we don't go with Houston Millett. So I feel like with that kind of with that caveat, with not choosing Chaz Lanier, Mikhail Brown-Jones makes a ton of sense. Our honorable mention here, JP Pegues, going from Furman to Auburn. I think he's going to do some great things in Bruce Pearl's system. Isaac, our next category was our most likely NBA draft pick. And there's a lot of options here. A lot of these guys are probably going to get picked in the NBA draft.
John Calipari.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like some of them are guys we're not going to talk about because we already had him on our first team. Like I think John L. Davis is probably going to get drafted next year. He's older prospect, so it'll probably be a little later. But we ultimately kind of waffled on a few different names here and decided to go with Big Z. Zvonimir Ivicic coming over, of course, from Kentucky to Arkansas following John Calipari. I don't think he's going to start for Arkansas. I know there's been some discussion on what that starting lineup might look like. My prediction is it's basically a bunch of transfers, and then Trevin Brazil is going to start at the 4. I think Adu starts at the 5, which is why I think Ivicic comes off the bench. But he doesn't need to play 25 minutes a game to be drafted. I think if he plays a quality role, if he displays the 3-point shooting and the shot blocking, those are the 2 skills. If he locks those down, he looks healthy, he stays on the floor, I think he's going to be a pretty clear lock to get drafted. And so I think he's kind of the obvious pick here in a group where there's a lot of other players who could be in this conversation.
Yeah, our other choices here for honorable mention are Jackson Robinson, who obviously comes from BYU to Kentucky, and then Adu Thiero, who entered the transfer portal while John Calipari was still there, and then ultimately still decided to follow him to Arkansas. Both those guys we expect to see. Andy, next up, sophomore breakout. We mentioned this young man's name earlier when we were talking about Alabama's class, but we got some in-state spiciness here as Aiden Holloway leaves Bruce Pearl and heads to Tuscaloosa to play with Nate Oates. Holloway was expected last year to just be really, really, really high level, and just kind of didn't do the things he needed to. 7.3 points a game, barely over 30% from 3, but while still taking just shy of 5 attempts per game, 4.9. So that's got to come up this year, but had 2.7 assists. We'd like to see more rebounds, 1.5. Somebody that came into college with a lot of hype and expectation. He's a 6'1" guard, so we'll see. Andy, what I'm hopeful for is that he can learn a lot behind Mark Sears. Maybe that can really help spur him on to have a better sophomore year here. But Andy, I'm really excited, more so about our honorable mention in this category.
Yeah. For Holloway, he's not going to have a huge role right away, so I don't know how much of a breakout we'll see, but I think he's going to be better as a sophomore than he was as a freshman. I think he's in the right system for that. But our honorable mention here is not exactly a sophomore. He was a junior college player. He played his first season of Division I basketball last year at North Texas, so we're counting this as a sophomore breakout because it is his second Division I year. It'll be at Vanderbilt. This is Jason Edwards. Jason Edwards averaged 19 a game last year for a very good North Texas program. I think it should be said. They're a quality team. They've produced high-level transfers in very recent years, especially when Grant McCaslin was their head coach. I think that they got themselves a really good lead guard type here in Edwards, and I think he's going to do big things for Mark Byington in that program.
Andy, dark horse candidate. We've already talked about one of Tennessee's transfers in a big way with Chaz Lanier, but another one that we're also very excited about is Darlin Stone Dubar, who comes over from Hofstra. Hofstra has had a couple guys through the years, really kind of pop at the high major level.
Aaron Estrada is a great example at Alabama.
Love that. And we expect him to be the next one. Last year, 17.8 points a game, shot just shy of 40% from 3 on 5.5 attempts per game, brought in 6.8 boards, 1.4 assists, 1.2 steals, just shy of a block a game. He's a 6'6" guard. Dude, Andy, I'm very excited to see how he translates to this SEC level. Started his career at Iowa State, so it's not going to be weird to him. He knows, but has had 3 straight productive years at Hofstra where he averaged double-digit points. Should be a fun thing to watch. And then our honorable mention here at Dark Horse, we have 2. One is Duke Miles, a name that a lot of people probably don't know, coming over from High Point to new SEC school, Oklahoma. He's a 6'2" guard. Last year, 17.5 points a game at High Point. The year before that, 14 points a game at Troy. So keep your eyes on Duke Miles. And our other honorable mention here is CJ Wilcher, who leaves a productive career at Nebraska and is going to be part of that backcourt with Wade Taylor IV at Texas A&M. Could be an opportunity to really blow up with Buzz Williams as his head coach.
Last category here was our Take 2 transfer. A couple guys that we really wanted to make sure we mentioned, and both of them kind of had unique off seasons in different ways. First is Riley Kugel. I feel like we got to mention Riley Kugel was a draft candidate last year at Florida, preseason draft candidate. Everybody thought, hey, he's going to break out. He's going to be a 2024 draft pick. Did not happen at Florida. He kind of struggled, ended up kind of getting pushed out of the starting lineup.
Way to go, Walter Clayton.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Clayton and Richard really kind of took over that Gators program. He hit the transfer portal early in the offseason and went to Kansas, and then didn't go to Kansas. Various reports on what exactly happened there. Obviously, Kansas brought in a handful of other very talented wings in Zeke Mayo and AJ Storr and Rylan Griffin. But ultimately, Riley Kugel decides, nope, I'm not going to Kansas, and I'm actually coming back to the SEC. He's going to Mississippi State. I'm very intrigued to see if Chris Jans can get something out of him that we kind of unlock him in a way that we didn't see in his first couple years at Florida. And then finally, we're 30 plus minutes into the show, and we haven't mentioned DJ Wagner much. We talked about him a little bit, but we didn't really feel like he belonged sophomore breakout, in part because he was good last year and he's not a dark horse because everybody knows who he is. So we're like, let's find a spot for him. He follows Coach Calipari to Arkansas. I was happy to see Wagner make the decision to return to college basketball. And, I think comparing it to somebody like Justin Edwards, who did not make the same decision, did not get drafted, does not look like he's going to be on an NBA roster next year, at least maybe on a 2-way. But it's unfortunate for Edwards. I feel for him, but Wagner probably would have succumbed to a similar fate. Now he has an opportunity to be on a very good Arkansas team with a veteran guard in Davis, with some freshmen behind him in Boogie Fland and Carter Knox and others. And I hope that we see Wagner be able to take that leap and potentially put himself in a position to be a draft pick this year and more on his own merit than it would have been last year. So excited to see what he can do.
That's well said, Andy. And I appreciate his humility as somebody, as we said earlier, that was the number 1 player in this class at one point, and says, you know what? Who cares what the projected path was? I need to do what makes sense for me and my long-term longevity in this sport.
Yeah. And to do it when you got outplayed by both your backups, it takes some humility.
Coach Cal, let's be honest.
It is, but it takes some humility to admit that and be like, I'm still willing to find the next spot and make this thing work. Hopefully it does for him. He's an easy kid to root for. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for us today and for this week. We're not done with the transfer portal series, though. We are going to come back on Monday. We're going to talk the best of the rest, transfers at mid-major programs, guys who may be transferred down. We're going to talk about that, all sorts of stuff to close out this 6 series episodes talking about transfer portals here. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen, your first watch of the day, for hanging out with us here in the middle of the summer, the middle of the off season for college basketball. We appreciate all of you. We're looking forward to not only our final episode of this series, but continuing to bring you fantastic college basketball coverage for the rest of the summer. Until then, though, folks, have a fantastic weekend. Apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. Talked about them quite a bit today. And until next week, peace.